the 6th month of it now, and so it seems to have slowed down. The fighting is rather less intense. The Ruskies took Lysychansk fort to go. They declared an operational pause. They're going to allow their soldiers to rest and to receive parcels. And so for 2 weeks, very little has happened in the Donbass, which shows you just how appalling the logistics are of the Russians. Now, I know when they began in the spring, that was a bit of a problem for them because the ground was too soft. It was too muddy. If you drive off the road, a lot of these heavy vehicles are going to sink into the mud. Well, that doesn't apply now. We're at the height of summer. The ground is that hard. But they've got other problems. Obviously, they've got quite a few vehicles destroyed, and there's some basic incompetence and disorganization, as well as corruption, as well as officers stealing fuel and tires and selling it on the black market and things like that. Out-of-date rations. But since Lysychansk, they've made very little by way of advance. Just a few hundred meters a day, some Ukrainian counterattacks. Well, they're obviously missile strikes, but the Russians, they're running very low on these modern guided missiles, having to use anti-ship missiles on land, which are much more inaccurate. Often the things are inaccurate. They've got these Katyusha rocket systems on the back of trucks. They have them since the Second World War. They fire lots of rockets, but they're only accurate to about 500 meters. With the HIMARS, which the Ukrainians have got, are accurate to within 1 meter. Therefore, if you want to destroy the same target, the Russians are going to have to use so many more Katyusha rockets. I mean, unless it's an incredibly big or soft target. So that's slowing them down. And remember, they don't have the microchips and whatever systems imported from Western countries or South Korea anymore to make these missiles. So that's a big headache for them. Let me see. I mean, the Ukrainians, they've got the Russians withdraw from Snake Island. The Ukrainians notably have not retaken it themselves. So these Russian missile attacks on Ukrainian cities are quite ineffectual. They kill civilians. They very rarely kill military personnel. Russians will kill civilians and then claim it was a military target. I would guess bogusly. I mean, they just don't have the accuracy. It's partly malevolence. It's partly it's a terror weapon just to intimidate the civilian populace, demoralize the Ukrainians. But morality aside, killing civilians usually doesn't actually weaken the enemy's war effort very much. If it's babies, if it's elderly people, okay, it's horrific to kill these people, but they're not contributing to the war economy. Obviously, it's military personnel, you'd be weakening the enemy by killing and wounding military people, but it was people who help the war industry somehow by working in a bullet factory or even driving a train or even being a nurse in a hospital or something like that. He or she is actually contributing to the war economy. So the deaths of those sort of civilians does enfeeble Ukraine. Remember, there are millions of Ukrainian civilians who moved to the West. And I mean, somebody's asking me, well, why are Western countries willing to welcome Ukrainian refugees, not Palestinian refugees or Afghan refugees so much? So partly it's to induce the Ukrainians to keep fighting. The Ukrainians think, well, my wife and children are safe, so therefore I can fight on. If my wife and children are there, maybe better surrender because my kids and my wife are going to get killed if we don't lay down our arms. Anyway, so the Ukrainians, they've bought time, more weapons have come in, they've managed to slow the Russians down. And some people thought that the Russians are going to speed up in the summer, and they're not. So although the Russians have got a major advantage in artillery, something like 9-1, the numbers don't really tell it, because what the Ukrainian artillery lacks in quantity is making up for in quality, and they could get far more. There are about 500 HIMARS in the world. NATO could give them all to to Ukraine. And obviously, NATO can obviously build more, but that's going to take a long time to do. NATO's not going to give them all, but it could do. And then there's also the question of, well, how many missiles do you have for these HIMARS? Because they only produce a few thousand a year. I mean, they could step up production. I don't know if they can treble it or whatever. And NATO's not given the very long-range rockets to Ukraine, which could easily reach deep inside Russia, seeing that's too provocative. Would Russia says, oh, this is NATO's attacking us, we're going to war? Well, I mean, if Russia can't win against Ukraine, how can they win against NATO? I don't think Putin's that insane that he wants a third world war. So Ukraine's talking about building a 1 million-man army. As they've got 1 million military-age males, that is feasible. Obviously, women can join the military as well. So the Ukrainian troops can be trained in NATO countries where they're safe, come back into Ukraine to fight. Of course, the Ukrainian boys are turning 18, and some of them are in Poland or Romania or wherever. And are they going to be conscripted? What do they refuse to go? Will the Polish police or Romanian police arrest them and force them to join the Ukrainian army? Maybe they might have to. So Kiev says his army will have expanded considerably, will have more weapons by the autumn, and will begin the pushback, will retake Kherson in September. And I think that's actually a doable objective. I'm not saying they'll do it for certain, but it is doable. Kherson is that major city in the south of Ukraine. It's the furthest west the Russians have advanced. There are three bridges, two road bridges, one rail bridge across the river there. The Ukrainians have damaged them all, therefore heavy Russian vehicles can't get across. They've not actually been destroyed. You could walk across, go across in a car, but not a tank, not artillery. That might cause the whole thing to collapse. So I suppose the Ukrainians have just got to keep hammering that, which means the Russians can't get enough supplies in, more artillery in or tanks in, and they find it difficult to withdraw. You could walk over it, but I mean, it might be a sitting duck when you're doing so. Anyway, so the Russians, they've reinforced Crimea, worried about that, and they've warned the Ukrainians off. We consider this to be a sovereign part of Russia. If you attack Crimea, they'll be held to pay. One thing is, the only drinking water for Crimea was supplied from a pipeline from Ukraine, and Ukraine didn't switch it off early in the war or blow it up, which I thought they should have done. So, but then civilians could die of thirst. Well, then Russia, you could end the war and get water, evacuate the civilians, or bring in a lot of water, and all your ships and trucks which are carrying military supplies will have to carry water instead, which will really slow down their attack. But it's now clear why Ukraine failed to perform some very rudimentary tasks at the beginning, like blowing up certain bridges to stop the Russian attack. And that's because the SBU, that's the Ukrainian Secret Service, was infiltrated with Russian agents. Now, Ukraine's been aware of this for some time. Of course, Russia and Ukraine were united in 1991. So a lot of these people, they had divided loyalties, were partly Russian by ethnicity, or just loyal to the whole idea of the Soviet Union, which no longer existed, want to be united with Russia, or just bribed, or were helping Russia because of blackmail, because of their sexual peccadillos, or I don't know, because of ego, the various reasons why somebody becomes a double agent. Now, the Ukrainians were aware of this and began retiring people who joined before the end of the Soviet era, recruiting more from Western Ukraine, more people who are indigenous speakers of Ukrainian, and they're more likely to fully identify with Ukraine, learning from the CIA techniques, regularly interviewing people, lie detector tests, but obviously didn't completely work to root out the rats. But nevertheless, there were a few Kremlin moles there. And President Zelensky even had to dismiss the head of the SBU, his childhood friend, not suggesting this guy was treasonous at all, but just was incompetent, was ineffectual in identifying these agents and getting rid of them. And so they think they've unmasked dozens of them. So NATO is now considering furnishing Ukraine with more sophisticated weaponry, such as tanks and combat jets. But these take months, if not years, to train on. But that might also be indicative of NATO thinking this war is going to last for ages. Now, Putin thinks he's got strategic patience, that NATO and European Union countries will eventually get fed up of this. They want peace, they'll be jittery, he can threaten them with nuclear war, they'll be frightened, they'll back down. And Russia's obviously used gas as a weapon. As you know, that Nord Stream pipeline to Germany, only 20% of capacity is being used. Kremlin's coming out with this lie again about the turbine is not working, so they can't do it at a higher rate. So for about a year, they've been reducing the gas they're selling. They could cut it off completely, especially in winter. So gas prices are very high. European Union countries have got a contingency plan to all reduce usage by 15%. Now, France gets 70% of its energy from nuclear energy, could provide more of that. It all goes back to Angela Merkel's fatal mistake in 2010 after Fukushima to phase out nuclear energy in Germany, which is very trendy with the Greens, but then that made them vulnerable to energy blackmail by Russia. So you can build these nuclear power stations, that take 5 years to do. And if we consider that relations with Russia won't have normalized after 5 years, and I'm sure they won't have, the thing is to do it now and bite the bullet. And then it's also green energy. I know there are problems and risks associated with nuclear energy, but we really have no choice. Now, I know we're just going to wear a jumper in winter, so we can turn the thermostat down, drive less, fly less, use less electricity, buy fewer items, because that represents energy in terms of manufacturing it, transporting it, the lights on in the shop and things like that. Yeah, and the NATO summit in Spain at the beginning of July, Ukraine obviously dominated the agenda. So anyway, the President Biden says he shall not allow allow Ukraine to be defeated. So yeah, we know Russia's scraping the bottom of the barrel for troops. That's why Gulagu.net, there's some prisoners' rights organizations in Russia, said the FSB, that's the Russian Internal Intelligence Agency, and Wagner, which is a mercenary group, have been going to Russian jails offering men freedom in return for enlisting in the military or rebuilding Ukraine. So yeah, they're running short of troops, and indeed, Russia confirmed the death of the first female soldier in combat in Ukraine, showing that they're running short of men because they don't like to send the women into combat situations. Anyway, so in the 17th of July, the head of the British military estimated that 50,000 Russians have been killed, wounded, or captured. Now, Ukraine gives a figure that's much, much higher. Now, in mid-March, Russia released a death toll of 1,351. The war had been going for even 1 month. It's now been going for 5 months, more than. So let's take that mid-March figure and multiply it by 5. That would now be 6,755. But we know it's got to be higher because that was less than 1 month. We know it's got to be more like 7,000. And of course, Russia's lying, as they do about everything. The real figure will be much grimmer for them. So I think conservatively estimate it's double that. I would conservatively estimate 14,000 killed, about 3 times as many wounded. Actually, rather few captured, under 1,000 captured. So if you all Russian men, they have to do 1 year in the military, aged 18. Though obviously, if you're rich, you can bribe your way out of it, claiming to be permanently medically unfit. Now the Russians are trying to get men to rejoin the colours. They can come back in their 20s, 30s, 40s, even their 50s to the army because they're that desperate for soldiers. But you're meant to be guaranteed at least a 4-week refresher course because you might have left the army decades ago, and there are also weapon systems now that they didn't have a long time ago. So some of them have been sent to the front line with only 5 days training, not the mandatory 4 weeks. So they're getting people to sign up for contracts for as little as 3 months. They're that desperate. But I think once you're in there, they probably wouldn't let you leave. So they've had to merge some units together because some units have been so depleted by heavy casualties. And the Russian army doesn't have a sufficient number of technicians and mechanics to repair broken vehicles and equipments. But those who sign these military contracts, they're offered very alluring salaries, about $3,800 a month, which is 4 times the average salary. So people from economically deprived regions find this irresistible. Now, very few Muscovites join because they're more affluent. So Putin is still refusing to order this general mobilization because that would mean his policy has failed and this is a war. But, Ukraine is suffering severe manpower deficiencies as well. They were admitting to suffering over 100 combat deaths a day a month ago. So wealthy men are able to bribe their way out, which causes disquiet because of the flagrant injustice. So we're all told that HIMARS will be the game changer. By the 30th of July, there's supposed to be 20 HIMARS in Ukraine. They have a range of 70 kilometers. The missiles they're using, there are slightly longer range ones. They're the much longer range rockets, which are 300 kilometers, but they're not doing that. So these cost at least $70,000 a pop, these missiles. So the Ukrainians are using them sparingly, not hitting individual tanks or artillery pieces, but only depots and so on. So ammunition dumps. So then the Russian artillery is no good if it doesn't have any ammunition. So they're made by Lockheed Martin, the United States, any country that manufactures them. Anyway, so they definitely are having an effect, and the Russians are worried about. They've even said that publicly, that destroying them is a priority. So the Javelin anti-tank weapons. I mean, the Ukrainians aren't using those enough against the Russians. Others should be penetrating behind Russian lines in small groups and blowing up their supply trucks as well as their artillery or whatever. And those 2B drones from Turkey are helping as well. Russia's so short of drones that they're buying them from Iran. Someone's saying no audio. You cannot hear me. I don't understand. There'll be no audio. There's audio for me. Okay. So the European Union is providing military aid, which it never did before. So the United States has given over $21 billion of military aid in 2022 alone. There's a $40 billion aid package, but not all of it's been furnished yet. And France is giving these Caesar cell-propelled howitzers, they're German howitzers as well. So Ukraine is firing up to 6,000 artillery rounds a day. So NATO's got to hurry up and manufacture more. I mean, Ukraine is virtually exhausted its supply of Soviet-era ammunition. Only delivered half of them. So Ukrainian snipers have been very effective in killing Russian generals, which really slows them down because it's so centralized. The Russian army, you never do anything without orders. The Surgeon General's been killed. Has he really been killed? We don't need to confirm that. Send that to headquarters. That takes ages. He's been killed, not wounded then. Okay, and then promote someone rather than someone automatically filling his place. So they can't advance, retreat, open fire, ceasefire, anything without orders, which really slows them down. But I wonder whether this prioritizing killing generals is foolish. If you can kill 10 ordinary soldiers in the time it takes to kill one general, should you maybe just not, let's just not wait for the general to come along, we'll kill ordinary guys. Anyway, so yeah, there might be stricter sanctions on Russia. Well, obviously, they're not buying gold and so on, these European Union countries. So Putin's thinking he'll have Western Europe on its knees over the lack of oil and gas. It's going to hurt in winter. There's no two ways about it. How much will it hurt Russia? Well, actually not that much, because obviously they can sell some to other countries. The International Monetary Fund has said these sanctions, yeah, they've dented the Russian economy, but nothing like as much as we thought. And the Russians say, well, might build another pipeline to China to sell more oil and gas over there, but that's going to take a few years to be built. But, European Union was transitioning away from oil and gas anyway. I suppose, morality aside, Putin was right to do this now, because in 10 years, the EU wasn't going to buy his oil and gas at all, so wouldn't be able to use that as a weapon. So use it whilst he still could. So yeah, more green energy is getting cheaper, technology is getting better. More nuclear energy as probably as a bridging solution until that green energy becomes affordable. And that's it. So yeah, he thinks that his country's got stomach for a fight. Remember, he's made something like $400 billion this year alone from energy sales because the prices are sky high. Yeah, so he's got a bit of a war chest. What if he sold no oil and gas to Western countries whatsoever? I think he could last for at least 2 years before, the coffers are dry. But even those sales to other countries, Asian countries, obviously that wouldn't be enough to keep going. At that point, he might have to change, but he might think that the West will break before he will. And remember, they got their big sovereign wealth fund, the Russians, but they've got about $300 billion in assets frozen in Western countries, which the West should confiscate and just give to the Ukrainians. But I think the West is holding off on that one. If Russia does something really to up the ante, like a nuclear strike, I think at that point the West might do that, say, let's not use this financial nuclear weapon until the Russians provoke us that much. Otherwise, then we've got nothing left to escalate to. So Ukraine says that Russia's put missile launchers in Ukraine's largest nuclear plant. The idea behind that is then the Ukrainians dare not strike it for fear of destroying the nuclear plant and causing a disaster. So yeah, the war has slowed down a lot. All right, well, thank you very much for watching my video. Follow me on Patreon. Look at my website, George from Ireland. Please donate to me on PayPal, George Callahan 79 at gmail.com. Thank you, bye.